welcome back. In the last lecture, we talked about allergies and hypersensitivities, and specifically, we talked about type 3 hypersensitivity, which is usually associated with a number of autoimmune diseases. And in this lecture, we're actually going to go into the different types of autoimmune diseases. And this is where the immune system really does actually attack the host instead of defending it from foreign invaders. So this cartoon kind of shows it quite aptly there. So at the end of this lecture, I hope you'll be able to describe what autoimmunity is, including the types, the systemic and target-specific categories, and then explain the mechanisms for key autoimmune diseases and their features, as well as how they are managed. So what is autoimmunity? Autoimmunity or autoimmune disease is caused by failure of the tolerance processes described above to protect the host from the action of self-reactive lymphocytes. So these are usually caused by immune stimulatory lymphocytes or antibodies that recognize self-components. So this is all associated with that idea of tolerance as well. We're supposed to be able to tolerate our own antigens, and in fact we're not supposed to respond against our own antigens, but in this case that has failed, and so we do respond to our own antigens, which then causes us to act against it, causing cellular lysis and inflammatory response in the affected organ. So this is actually not too uncommon. About 3 to 8% of people in the industrialized world, high-income countries, I suppose, have some form of autoimmune disease. And what's interesting is it's more common in females. We categorize autoimmune diseases as organ-specific, where they only attack one organ, or if it's systemic, if it affects multiple systems or organs, whether they're T-cell mediated or whether they're antibody mediated. So here is some prevalence of different autoimmune diseases and the ratios for male to female ratios. Quite interesting, you can see 50-to-1 ratio for Hashimoto's thyroiditis, so much more common in females. In fact, quite a few of them are much more common in females. So the question is, and I'll open this up on the forum, why do you think autoimmune diseases are more common among women? So let's talk about autoimmunity against target organs. So examples of this include Hashimoto's thyroiditis, type 1 diabetes, mellitus, and Myasthenia gravis. So with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, is where production of autoantibodies and sensitized Th1 cells specifically target thyroid antigens. So the antigens in the thyroid are recognized by these antibodies and these T helper cells. So obviously when the autoantibodies bind, it interferes with the iodine uptake and then leads to decreased thyroid function and causes hypothyroidism. So you'll have this condition of an enlarged thyroid or goiter, as we call it. It also results in a DTH response, where you have intense infiltration of lymphocytes, macrophages, and plasma cells, and they form these follicles with germinal centers. The other one is called type 1 diabetes mellitus. This is also an organ-specific one where there's an autoimmune attack on the beta cells scattered in the pancreas. So it's quite common in children under age of 14. It's less common than type 2, which is called non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. So this one is insulin dependent. And it starts with the cytotoxic T lymphocyte infiltration and activation of the macrophages, or insulitis. So this is followed by cytokine release and production of autoantibodies, which then leads to a cell-mediated delayed type hypersensitivity response, or type 4, and cytokine release. So beta cell destruction, or the cells in the pancreas destroyed by the DTH response, will then contribute to the decreased production of insulin, and then of course the increase in blood glucose levels. So this can also result in serious metabolic problems like ketoacidosis, and one of the common symptoms for people with diabetes type 1 is increased urine production. In the late stages can be quite worse. Atherosclerotic vascular lesions can occur, gangrenes in the extremities because you've got impeded blood flow. and renal failure, blindness, and death can also occur. So the therapy for type 1 diabetes mellitus is daily administration of insulin. So you can see this is in the picture a normal islet of Langerhans from the pancreas of a normal mouse, and this is the one with a mouse that has a disease resembling diabetes. So you've got a lot of cellular infiltration in the islet cells. Another one is called Myasthenia gravis, and this is mediated by blocking autoantibodies. And it was discovered when rabbits immunized with acetylcholine receptors purified from electric eels became paralyzed. And this is because the autoantibodies generated bind to these receptors on the motor ends of the plate muscles, and they block normal binding of acetylcholine and later induce complement-mediated lysis of the cells. So the skeletal muscles get progressively destroyed and weaker. So this is also autoantibody mediated. Some early signs of the disease is drooping eyelids and inability to retract the corners of the mouth. But there are good treatments for this, so people can lead a normal life even if they have myasthenia gravis. So one way is to increase acetylcholine levels or using cholinesterase inhibitors, decreasing antibody production using corticosteroids or other immunosuppressants, or actually removing the antibodies, the autoantibodies, using plasmapheresis. So those are our organ-specific ones. So we've got systemic autoimmune disorders where they target different antigens that are involved in a number of organs and tissues. And they involve a general defect in the immune regulation. So you've got hyperactive T cells or B cells, and the damage is widespread. And it can be cell-mediated as well as autoantibody mediated. So examples are SLE, systemic lupus erythomatosus, multiple sclerosis, as well as rheumatoid arthritis. So the first one is systemic lupus erythomatosus, or SLE, and this is a very common autoimmune disease in women between 20 and 40 years old, especially if they're African American or Hispanic. And there seems to be a very strong genetic component. So in identical twins, if one of the twins have SLE, about 60%, there's a 60% chance that the other twin will also develop SLE. And you also have a lot of close relatives having SLE. And this is a characteristic feature of the SLE, which is that butterfly rash on the face. So what happens is that in SLE, the autoantibodies will target a lot of different tissue antigens, including DNA, histones, red blood cells, platelets, leukocytes, clotting factors. So it's found all over your body. And signs and symptoms include fever, weakness, arthritis, skin rashes, kidney dysfunction. So the autoantibodies for the red blood cells will obviously lead to hemolytic anemia and thrombocytopenia. Or when the immune complexes with different nuclear antigens are deposited on the small blood vessels, you'll develop a type 3 hypersensitivity reaction. And you'll trigger like a complement reaction as well. And in severe cases, if the complement is activated, it might lead to neutrophil aggregation. And over time, you'll have a lot of neutrophils. A lot of the circulating neutrophils will be declined, and you'll have neutropenia, occlusions in small blood vessels, which can cause widespread tissue damage. So how is it diagnosed? Usually by detecting the anti-nuclear antibodies. So these are antibodies against DNA and histones, which is found in SLE. And they do this by indirect immunofluorescence staining in the serum of the patients. And they treat lupus or SLE based on signs and symptoms, so usually using corticosteroids or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Another systemic autoimmune disease is multiple sclerosis. So this is also a very common cause of neurologic disability in Western countries. So this is caused by autoreactive T cells that lead to formation of inflammatory lesions along the myelin sheath of nerve fibers in the brain and spinal cord. So it attacks your nervous system. Yeah. So the myelin is usually what insulates the nerve fibers. So if it attacks the myelin, then it will cause a lot of neurologic dysfunction, and you'll start feeling things like numbness in the limbs, as far as paralysis, loss of vision. And some of the factors that may cause people to get multiple sclerosis include environmental exposures, genetic, and as well as infection by certain viruses like Epstein-Barr virus. Another systemic autoimmune disease is rheumatoid arthritis. So this is also very common in women, but in older women, unlike the SLE. So what happens is autoantibodies called rheumatoid factors, which are usually IgM antibodies, bind to the Fc region of the IgG. So this is where the rheumatoid factor will bind the circulating IgG and form the IgM-IgG complexes. So this is that feature of your type 3 hypersensitivity reaction. So it'll start depositing in different places, usually the joints, and that's where you get the inflammation and all the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. So this is how a bad rheumatoid arthritis looks like. And treatments include non-specific drugs to reduce the inflammation and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So some factors that cause autoimmunity, basically two things. We know some of them are very genetically predisposed, but there are also environmental triggers such as viral infections as well, and together they somehow lead to autoimmunity. For genetic factors, there are certain alleles in the MHC and non-MHC inherited genetic mutations that are known to be associated with autoimmune disorders. One example is the MHC or HLA allele for ankylosing spondylitis. So the HLA B27 is actually 90 times elevated in people who develop ankylosing spondylitis. And interestingly, 90% of this is seen in males. So a lot of the other autoimmune diseases, you see it in females more often, and this one is in males. And then there's also examples like the non-MHC genes, like the AIR and FOXP3. And we remember FOXP3 from our tolerance lecture. And any mutations or deficiencies in these will impact the central and peripheral tolerance. Right, so this is some other examples of genetic associations with autoimmune disease. Now, for environmental triggers, we know that there are actually certain geographic locations or particular climates that will encourage or be a factor for developing autoimmune disease. But this may also be a proxy for lifestyle factors, diet, even the microbes that we're exposed to. So one thing that we know now is the interaction between the gut microflora and the immune system helps regulate peripheral tolerance, and so any changes in this may result in the development of autoimmune disease. For example, animals that live in germ-free environments tend to end up being more susceptible to autoimmune disease. So if you think about it, the immune system needs to do work somehow. So if you prevent them from meeting true invaders, what do? They start turning against host cells. So that's where there has to be sort of that balance with exposure. But in saying that, some infections actually can cause autoimmunity. So this is usually what happens when an infection results in the release of sequestered self-antigens, and that encourages immune activation rather than tolerance. So we know that in certain compartments, self-antigens might be sequestered, but because of infection, the tissue might be destroyed or compromised, and that gets released, and so then that triggers an autoimmune response. So these are some pro-inflammatory environmental factors. So we've got infections, toxins, stress, food, all of these can play a role. But usually it's a combination of factors that leads to autoimmunity. So you've got some genetic predisposition or anything that causes some abnormality in cells like the Treg cells or self-reactive T and B cells, coupled with exposure to different carcinogens or pathogens, such as, for example, the Epstein-Barr virus. Or when you get infected with certain viruses that actually have antigens similar to the host antigens, which is what we call molecular mimicry, this will later confuse your immune cells. So even when they're gone, the immune cells will think it's the antigens from the virus and then start attacking those host cells. Then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the release of sequestered antigens. But we also know that there's also a gender influence, so maybe there's some hormones associated as well. So some of the treatments tend to fall under two categories, either broad spectrum, just to suppress the immune system in general, but there are more recent targeted therapies like to neutralize pro-inflammatory cytokines or interfere with lymphocytes, rather than just suppressing the immune system entirely, because that will cause other problems as well. But that tends to do the job for the most part. It doesn't cure, but it does reduce the symptoms. Things like those anti-inflammatory drugs or corticosteroids. But of course, because they're so general, they can cause cytotoxicity, and it also, when you're suppressing your immune system, you might be more likely to get severe infection or even develop cancer. In some diseases, there's also a need to even remove the organ or the toxic compounds that can alleviate the symptoms. For example, if plasmapheresis to remove the antibodies to eliminate the antigen-antibody complexes. And then you've got cell type specific strategies. So, for example, strategies that target the B cells are monoclonal antibodies against CD20, called rituximab, which depletes the B cell subset and to provide short-term benefit for rheumatoid arthritis, just to reduce the number or the amount of autoantibodies made. And then T cell targets, which are usually antibodies that target the CD3 molecule, so that they deplete T cells. And that works with some efficacy for type 1 diabetes, but it still induces a more broad spectrum immunosuppression, which is not ideal. There are also anti-CD4 antibodies that have been shown to reverse multiple scleroma and arthritis in animal models, but it doesn't seem to work as much in humans. Then you've got anti-inflammatory therapies. So these are drugs that block the cytokines. So for example, TNF-alpha blockers are used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, statins to reduce cholesterol levels, and other compounds that block chemokine or adhesion molecules. So those can also reduce the inflammation at the site and reduce the autoimmune process. So there's also strategies to interfere with co-stimulation. So if you recall, the T cells to be activated needs both at the antigen via the TCR and then a co-stimulation or co-receptor binding to be fully activated. Otherwise, it becomes anergic. So there are some new therapeutic proteins like Orencia, which has been approved for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, where it actually blocks the CD80 or 86 on APCs from engaging the CD28 on T cells. So even though the antigen is present, the co-stimulation is not, because it's been blocked. So instead of being activated and then causing an autoimmune response, the T cell develops energy instead. Some other new therapies that are being developed are antigen-specific immunotherapies. So these are strategies trying to select for specific autoreactive cells while not targeting other leukocytes that are not autoreactive. So for example, the glatiramer acetate, they selectively increase the number of Treg cells. So that's quite helpful because Tregs help reduce autoimmune outcomes. Or administration of ex vivo generated tolerogenic immune cell populations. So you actually give cells that are more tolerogenic, and this is currently in the preclinical trial stage. These are also some other examples, specific therapies, like for example insulin. We know that replaces the insulin that's been depleted in type 1 diabetes, but the others can be anti-inflammatory, immunosuppressive, and then some other examples. Yeah, and I think that's it. That's basically the end. So look out for the next short quiz. I think this one we'll just do a very, very short one just to cover the lectures on hypersensitivity and autoimmune disease. And I'll see you next week. Thank you.